Hola a todos, soy Javier Poveda y esto es De Bien TV, el canal donde te lo vas a pasar de bien mientras aprendes geografía, historia del arte, economía y empresariales, un poquito. Este vídeo va para cuarto de la ESO sección, CEIPSO el Encinar de Torrelodones, esta versión reducida de la intro. So in this unit we are going to study the interwar years period. This is our unit 7 and as usual we are going to divide it in two parts, and the first part is going to be, of this unit 7, the economy in the interwar years period. So these years, the interwar years period, is a period between the two world wars, the first and the second, so it is between 1918 and 1939. And we are going to study the several phases of this period, which are the post-war crisis, the recovery in the 1920s, and the end of these roaring 20s with the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the Great Depression of the 1930s. So let's start. At first, we have the post-war crisis between 1918 and 1923, in which Europe experienced a crisis, an economic crisis. Why? Because of the high levels of debt, because of the war, since the countries asked for a lot of loans, mainly to the United States. Why? To pay the costs of the war, like as you can read there, food and military equipment. And once the war ended in 1918, these loans had to be paid, but sometimes there was not enough money to do that. And also a shortage of products. A shortage is escasez, due to the destruction of areas of agricultural land, factories and transport systems. When there is not enough supply for a product, but the demand stays high, the consequence is that the prices rise, so inflation. As you can see here in this chart, this is the net debt percentage of on the GDP. The GDP es el PIB, Producto Interior Bruto. And at the beginning of the war, it's in the United Kingdom. It stays in normal values, 20, 40, 60, 90, but in the years after the end of the war, it peaked at 180% of the GDP, which is a lot. And also in some countries, especially in the ones who were defeated, such as Germany, this crisis was way more important because they had to pay the war reparations. Oops. A ver. So we have seen a chart of the British debt, and this is the German debt. The World War first begins, okay, it goes more or less 125%. After the Treaty of Versailles, it starts to decrease, but then the hyperinflation, boom, 350% of the GDP. So they had to pay 3.5 times the richness of their own country, which is impossible because they were in bankruptcy. As you can see here, the debt of the different countries, the most affected was Germany, almost 3 times their GDP, but also France and the UK, and as you can see here, the United States had a very low levels of debt. So what did mostly the Germans did to solve this economic crisis? They started to print money. Great mistake. So in this country, a lot of banknotes started to circulate, but they were not backed by any kind of value, usually the gold. So the prices started to rise a lot exponentially. You can see this here. Okay, so they have to print and print and print more banknotes, and the value of those banknotes was higher time to time. So well, we will see that now. So when the prices, since the money has no value, then the prices rise, and they rose a lot, as you can see here. Okay, in a period of a couple of years, the prices multiplied by boom, 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 almost 1 billion times. And this is called hyperinflation. So the inflation is the generalized rise of the prices, but when it happens in a very short period of time, it is called hyperinflation. And in addition, in 1923, since the German government was not paying the war reparations that were established in the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, they decided to occupy the region of the Ruhr, which is a region, a very industrialized region in Germany, which is next to the Rhine River and next to the border of Belgium and France. So they could take the resources they needed, since the Germans were not paying these reparations. This occupation lasted for 2 years until the year 1925. Here you can see the inflation in the post-World War First period, and this is the percentage. Okay, we have a base 100 here in 1919. This is the inflation of the several European and the American countries, okay, which is a lot, but okay, it fits in the graph. And this is Germany, boom, it goes out of the graph a lot. As you can see here, $1 US was worth 4 trillion German marks. So the value of 1 German mark was almost nothing. So they started to print money, and the nominal value, which is the value that is written in the banknote, started to rise a lot. Here you have 50,000, 500,000, 50 million, 500 million, 5,000 million, or 5 billion in English, and then 500 billion, and 5 trillion in English, or 5 billion in the European system, and 50,000 billion. Well, I cannot read this. This should be 50 trillion in English and 100 trillion in English marks. Okay, this is a banknote of this value. So since the banknotes were worthless, many people used them for other purposes. For example, to cover a wall, or children playing with them, then again covering a wall. This is the equivalent of $1 American, the equivalent in German marks, as you can see here, or even they burnt it to heat their homes, or they made a kite to play in the countryside, and children playing again, because the value, the paper in which the banknote was printed, was more valuable than the value in marks of the banknote itself. And as you can see here in this medal, by the 1st of November of 1923, 1 slice of bread, 3 billion, 1 pound of meat, of meat, 36 billion, and 1 glass of beer, 4 billion, 4 billion, not billion like it's written here. This is a mistake. This is the worst period of the hyperinflation. And this is the Ruhr region in Germany. Okay, this is France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. This is the Rhine River, and these are the areas that were occupied by the Allied troops, the British, the French, and mostly the French and Belgium. That was occupied of Germany, okay, because here there were located most of the coal mines of Germany and most of these coal industries. A ver. So since this situation was not sustainable, the United States came with a plan to the recovery of the European economy, and this plan was called the DOS plan, after the Vice President of the United States. And this plan was applied or was approved in 1924 for Germany. It consisted in some economic measures which involved loans and investments in the German economy and in the German industry. Why? Because if the German economy recovered, then they could be able to pay back the war reparations to England and France, and well, to the United Kingdom and France, and therefore England and France could pay back their loans to the United States. And also those plan included the revision and reduction of the war reparation payments of Germany. So they extended the deadline of these payments of the war reparations of Germany and also reduced its amount. And all of the allies were or agreed with this plan, so they abandoned the occupation of the Ruhr in 1925. And since that year, the German economy began to recover and they were able to pay these reparations, so the allies could pay back their loans to the United States. And after this, the economy recovered and there was a period of prosperity that lasted until the Wall Street crash of 1929, and this period is called the Roaring Twenties, los felices años 20. Here, this is a diagram showing the DOS plan. So first, the United States loans Germany money to pay the reparations and to develop their industry. Then Germany could reactivate their economy, so they could generate some profit, so they could pay back the allies on agreed upon lower rate, because the DOS plan included a lower rate of these war reparations as well as a reduced amount and how do you say this? A longer deadline. And since they received, England and France received these war reparations, they could pay back the US the money they owed them. Okay, and this is Charles DOS. So, and this plan was a success because in 1920, as you can see, the war reparations were the value of the war reparations were up to 295% of the German GDP, and after this plan started in 1924, and there was some revisions to this plan in the years after the Young Plan and the Lausanne Conference. The Germans could, the German economy started to thrive, so by the year 1932, they had to pay only, the value of the reparations were only the 19% of their GDP. And this is a couple of pictures of the Roaring 20, Josephine Baker dancing the Charleston, and this is Los Angeles in 1920 with all of these cars, etc, etc. Well, this is a video of the Charleston if you have some curiosity. No! Where am I? No. Okay. But this period, the Roaring Twenties, ended with the Wall Street crash of 1929, in which the Wall Street stock market collapsed. And this was the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Which were the causes of this collapse? The following. We can group them in three main types. The industrial overproduction. Why? Because the American industry during the World War I, since their territory was not affected by the war, they could increase the production to supply their own industry and the needs of their allies, mainly England and France. But after the war, the European industry started to work again, so they didn't need, or they could not, or they didn't need to import all of the goods that they imported during the war years. But the American industry did not reduce their levels of production, so they started to accumulate stocks. Why? Because the demand could not afford the supply that they were producing. This means that they had to reduce prices, and they started to lose money. If they lose money, they fire people. If they fire people, the unemployment rate rises. And if there is unemployed people, they could not buy the products. They could not afford them. So it's a cycle in which the consumption started to decrease. Also, the agricultural overproduction, which is a similar process that the one that happened in the industry. And again, after the war, the European countries started a recovery in their agricultural production, so there was a surplus in the production of the American agriculture. So again, the prices started to low down. And finally, the speculation on the stock market and excessive bank credit. Why? Because in times of prosperity, the companies and also the individuals, they since it's very easy to make money in the stock market, they started to buy more and more actions, or no actions, eso es una burrada que acabo de decir, shares of these companies, because the prices are constantly rising, and they even asked for loans to buy these shares in the stock market. But when the shares in the stock market when their prices are, well, they are overpriced because of this speculation, because it does not reflect the real value of the companies, this is called a bubble, no, una burbuja, and the bubble explodes. Always a bubble explodes, and this happened in this Wall Street crash. Here you can see a graph in which these are the stocks, okay, of the industrial and agricultural products, more and more and more and more, and the prices go down. Okay, this is again the overall price index in the United States, low since 1929 to 1932, and the prices were lower and lower and lower and lower. And finally, the increase in demand of these shares led to a rise in their prices. Okay, if there is a lot of demand of a good, their price always goes up. And this caused the stock market speculations. The shares were bought in order to make quick profits. So I can buy a share today, and in a week maybe I can double my profit, despite the fact that the share value did not reflect the real value of the companies, which were bankrupt or in financial crisis. So if we have said that there was an industrial and agricultural production, these companies are losing money. But in the stock market, the values are rising and rising and rising, and they are growing, and they don't reflect the real value of these companies. So, ping, explosion. When these companies began to have problems, and when the investors acknowledged this, they suddenly started to sell all of their shares. And there was a day, which is the 24th of October of 1929, which is called the Black Thursday, in which a lot of shares were sold. 30 or were tried to, they tried to sell these shares, and almost 13 million shares went up for sale. When there is a lot of supply in this case of shares, but a very few demand, in this case people wanted to buy these shares, then there's an oversupply and the prices fall down. And this is the Wall Street crash. So as financial crisis started, the banks were without liquidity, the access to money, because the investors who could not sell their shares did not have the money to pay back their loans. So these loans that were given to the people to buy shares, they weren't paid back. So the banks didn't have access to money, so they went on bankruptcy and they had to close. And almost 5,000 banks out of 23,000 closed in this period, and millions of citizens were ruined. This is the industrial average of the Dow Jones, which is the Wall Street index, and this is the Black Thursday. And in October, November, in just 1 month, boom, from here to here. This is the Wall Street crash. Or here, boom, and boom. In just a couple of years, the stock market lost, well, this is 200, almost 220 index, and here 3 years later is only 40. So they lost almost 3 times their value. And this is the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And this depression continued for a decade. This led to a fall in prices, a deflation, which is the opposite of inflation, and the prosperity of the Roaring '20s. And this crisis, which started in the United States, spread to the rest of Europe because the United States were the one investing in Europe. We saw that in the Dawes Plan. What were the consequences? The companies closed because they couldn't sell their products, the wages fell and the unemployment increased because many people they could not be paid, and the world economy was affected because of the reasons I just have said. So therefore the main consequence is a decrease in the standard of living, and this is going to be one of the main causes of the rise of totalitarianisms, which we will see in the next part. This is the unemployment rate of the United States. Here it is almost 0, and then boom, here again, and they peaked at more than 25%, which is a lot for the United States. And the level of unemployment stayed high until the beginning of the Second World War. Okay, this is a bank run in which many customers tried to take out their savings from their banks, but the banks didn't have the money, so there was a problem. The problem was the unemployed people who weren't able even to eat. So this is a soup kitchen in which they were given free soup. How did this depression was solved or tried to be solved? With the New Deal of the new President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which started in 1933, which are a series of economic measures to try to stimulate the demand. It's an investment of public money. They give subsidies, so economic help, to agricultural producers so that they could pay off their loans. They carried out public works, so the public employment could be created. They limited agricultural and industrial production, so there is not an oversupply, and the prices can start to rise. And they established the government control of the stock market and the bank system to avoid this speculation. And also, which is very significant in the United States, the establishment of a minimum wage and an unemployment compensation. So subsidies to unemployment. And the economy of the United States started to recover slowly, very slowly, but they didn't reach the levels of the Roaring '20s until the breakup of the Second World War. And that's it. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is propaganda of the New Deal. This is the GDP of the United States. Since 1929 it started to fall, and then after the New Deal it started to recover very, very slowly, and then boom, with the breakout of the World War II. And this is it. Pues eso es todo. Me ha salido un vídeo un poco así chusta, pero es lo que hay. Espero que este vídeo os haya ayudado y en la segunda parte veremos los regímenes totalitarios que se desarrollan en Europa, que es en parte consecuencia de esta crisis económica. Lo dicho, espero que os haya gustado, espero que os haya servido y para cualquier duda ya sabéis que me podéis escribir Aula Virtual o por mis redes sociales, que no hace falta que las repita. Muchas gracias por haberlo visto hasta el final, si has tenido el valor, y nos vemos en el próximo.